I originally played the Battle Network games when I was a teenager, starting with 3 and branching out from there as the newer games released and I found the older ones secondhand. I've been looking forward to the Legacy Collection so I could see how the games stack up to my memories of them, starting with the original Battle Network. I remember this one not being as hard as some of the other entries I played, being a lot simpler as well, and while not a bad game, not really stacking up to the rest of the series. I managed to get through the game on stream, so it's finally time to compare nostalgia to reality. I'm Wes, the Explosion, and this is Megaman Battle Network, originally for the Game Boy Advance. I guess we should start with the general plot, especially since not everyone might be familiar with Battle Network. In the classic series, Doctors Light and Wily work together to create a new type of machine called Robot Masters, until the latter betrays the former, kicking off conflict and beginning the series proper. In the Battle Network series, these two actually competed for research funding. Dr. Light, now going by the Japanese equivalent of Dr. Hikari, worked on internet technologies that would form the basis of this world. Wily, on the other hand, was still pretty fixated on robots, and he does not take losing the spotlight in Grant well. Anyway, as part of this interconnected society, a good chunk of people have a special type of program called a net navi, which can run around the net, fighting viruses and performing various tasks. Many of the custom models are actually based off of the Robot Masters from the classic series, and similarly, despite them having distinct personalities, they allegedly aren't fully sentient. The physical and digital worlds can affect each other, like blocking the Metroline's computer network to make it unable for the real thing to run, or cutting off the flow of electricity in the real-world generator to make it so that a Navi can no longer use its power to heal. Thus, the game is played on 2 fronts, as the net upland Hikari in the human world and Megaman.EXE, the digital version of our classic hero on the net. Lan's a 5th grader who fate seems to have tasked with fighting the terrorist acts of WWW, or World 3, Wily's organization who I guess collectively decided that, rather than live in a world without awesome robots, they'd rather live in no world at all. Or they think they're working towards world domination and Wily's keeping the whole nihilism thing to himself. Either way, with these games being broadly classified as RPGs, there's a bit more story than usual here, and while this one can be pretty well summed up as bad guy does bad thing, Lan and Megaman work together to stop bad thing, rinse and repeat until credits, there are a few twists and turns that I don't want to spoil here. Instead, let's move on to gameplay, which I'll go over more in depth in this first review since, again, people who play only exclusively the platformers probably don't even know what a battle chip is. As Lan, you do typical overworld things, running around, talking to other characters, advancing the plot, and, when near an electronic, jacking Megaman into the network. This is especially important when things hit the fan and Megaman needs to go into the system to solve the problem, though you'll still need to switch back to Lan at points, him needing to push something in place or solve a real-world problem to help Megaman out. As for his side of things, he has his own areas to navigate with their own puzzles and find mystery data, diamond-shaped pickups that are sometimes set, sometimes random, but the big thing is virus busting, as well as fighting the net navis that serve as bosses. You move around a 6x3 grid, each side getting 9 blocks, and while Megaman still has a buster to plink enemies with, the big part of combat for him is your collection of battle chips, which you can keep 30 of in your folder at a time. Each turn, Lan will send 5 your way, though if you don't pick any of them and hit add instead, you'll get another row of options added in, and you can do this up to 2 times in a row. Once you do select some, you go back to the standard 5 again though. Why bother choosing at all and just take everything you're given into battle instead? Well, there are limits to what you can use in a single turn. Each chip has a code, represented by a single letter. Each turn, you can only take in chips with the same code, so if you have a sword S and a steel S, using both is legal. You can also take in multiples of the same chip even if they don't have the same code, like picking a cannon A and a cannon C for example. You can only use one method at once though. As for the chips themselves, most do damage, listed on the label with different ranges and hitboxes described there as well, though there are support chips, things like heals and moves that let you steal some of your opponent's area. There are also Navi chips, which will freeze the action to summon a boss and have them attack in your stead. These tend to be some of the most powerful and why you're limited to just 5 in your folder at once. Some chips have elements as well, or besides just the standard null type. Heat beats wood, wood beats elect, elect beats aqua, aqua beats heat, coming full circle, and using the type that's strong against an elemental enemy nets you double damage. And don't ask me why heat, wood, elect, and aqua instead of fire, plant, elect, and water. I've tried to come up with a few guesses, but every time I've found a contradiction, so it's not worth thinking too hard about. One other fun little trick is the program advance. Choose the right set of chips in the right order and get a more powerful version of the move. Sometimes it has to do with codes, cannons A, B, and C getting you one. Sometimes the chips just have to have a logical theme, like sword, wide sword, and long sword. You need to consider all these things that I've mentioned while building your folder, and while that probably sounds pretty tedious, as long as you just swap things out a bit at a time as you get better and better stuff as opposed to completely building it from the ground up, it actually isn't too bad. You get a rating each battle you fight based on how well you do. Things like time, number of opponents, and how much damage you take play a factor, and the higher your busting level, the more money or better chance you have of them dropping a chip. So if you want to improve your arsenal, doing well in combat is a must. If you run out of all your chips in battle, you need to rely on your buster, but they refresh between fights, and you also heal after each round, so this isn't too much of a threat. Megaman's not completely helpless on his own. Well, he does kind of almost start out that way. You begin with a basic buster, doing 1 damage without being able to fire all that fast. You can find power-ups to increase one of the 3 stats as you explore though, so worry not. Power will add 1 extra point of damage to your basic shot, Rapid will let you fire faster, and Charge will allow you to, well, charge. First adding the ability, then increasing how fast and how far you can do so. Each stat goes from 1 to 5. Since power adds to your overall damage, feeding into the other 2 as well, I typically start with that, then move on to charge. While rapid adds to your rate of fire, the closer you are to an enemy, the faster you can attack anyway, which is why I leave it for last. You can get another type of power-up, HP memory, to add 20 points to your maximum HP, and there are a lot more of these. You start with 100, but can bump that all the way up to 1000. Both types of upgrades can either be found in specific sets of mystery data or purchased from shops, though the last thing we have to talk about can only be bought. There are armors, one for each element. These half the damage you take, except for attacks of the type the armor is weak against, which will do the standard amount. This is why you always read item descriptions, since I thought the armor would only reduce damage from either the same type or element the armor was strong against, and thus ran around over half the game naked since I thought they were too situational to be worth getting. My fault for using Pokemon logic. Nothing too crazy this time around, but if you seek out enough power-ups and spec Mega Man correctly, you can be a force of nature even without battle chips. Still probably want them for convenience though. The areas in this one are pretty hit or miss. Land gets 4 in the physical world, the main one being his hometown of AC/DC. This place is laid out pretty nicely, having Land's house, the school, a park, a chip shop, and all his friends' homes as well. Take the metro to reach the rest of the areas, like the government complex. This has a leisure area, as well as the waterworks and Scilab. While there's a few notable NPCs you can fight, and one quizmaster to challenge, for the most part, everything else is just story stuff. Then there's Den Town, which I hate. It's a series of blocks that look largely the same, each one not numbered in the way you'd expect, with traffic constantly going so that you either have to wait for the light to change or hope there's an underground staircase that'll just pop you over to the other side, with a few paths arbitrarily blocked off to make this already aggravating area even more so. It sucks to navigate this place, one NPC even commenting on how confusing Den Town is, but saying you'll get used to it eventually, which, despite what the developers might think, does not make things better. I'd say luckily you only need to be here for one chapter, but you need to come back several times to talk to specific people, and there's one person who I not only like fighting, but their shop offers a nice shortcut to get deeper into the main internet area, though at least I learned how to get to her place pretty quickly. And then there's the final area, WWW's main base. While you do need to find a secret train to get there, this place is pretty straightforward. You just needing to send Mega Man into some mini dungeons to advance through what is an otherwise linear path. On the net side of things, there are 3 types of areas. My favorites are the ones themed around a boss, which, as per the genre, were referred to as dungeons. I like most of these. The oven network is pretty simple, your path being blocked by fires which you can put out with ice blocks. You only have so many of these though, so if you run out, you need to refresh your stash, which will also revive the fires you already extinguished. It's about as hard as you'd expect from the starting area. The school network is a bit more labyrinthine, but the big challenge are the code doors that block your way. The answer to some are found in the real world, others you have no clue and have to guess, though you'll be told whether you're too high or too low. And don't worry, it's a kid's game, so these aren't too hard either. The waterworks I absolutely hate. You running around a frozen network, sliding about on ice, and sometimes needing to do so at a specific angle so that you get shunted onto the exact path you need. It might be my stupid fingers, but this dungeon gave me the most trouble out of all of them. Then there's a traffic light stage where you have to hit spheres of light to change the paths from red to blue. This can be a little tricky since you have only so much visible at once and you're constantly getting interrupted by random encounters, but you can also kinda just stumble through a lot of the solutions, so it ain't horrible. The power plant is a good deal harder. Having invisible paths that you can kind of intuit based on how the visible bits terminate, and parts where you have to slot in batteries to light up a new path, though only certain slots actually work. The main frustration here is that you can only use a battery twice before it needs recharge, meaning repeated screw-ups lead to a lot of backtracking to specific NPCs, as well as a time limit that the game actually gives you a solution to, so it's only stressful at first when you think it'll be more of a factor. The final area is just a bunch of mini remixes of each of these stages, which is really frustrating for the waterworks bit, but otherwise just more of the slightly more challenging same. Then there are specific electronics you can jack into, which aren't too big and normally just serve to net you an extra power-up or chip, as well as be hunting grounds for specific viruses. Normally there's nothing too important in these, and they serve mostly as fun little ways to make sure you're paying attention, for the small little bonuses. Then there is the bane of my, and many other players' existence, the main internet area. A bunch of nondescript paths with a bunch of vaguely connecting ports. It is an absolute nightmare trying to find anything here without looking up a map online. There are a few patterns, like the round spots typically being where they put splits in the paths, and the wider routes without the line down the middle typically leading in the general direction of the next area, but with how samey everything looks, this helps very little. Not only are there no major landmarks, you can't even tell which part of the net you're in. In later games, you get a location name in the pause menu. Something simple like Internet Area 3, which isn't much, but it is something. And actually change up the visuals slightly when you head into a different part of the world's net equivalent, but everything here is just the same bland sights. You can create shortcuts, but most of them require some doing. First, you need to go into one of your allies' PCs, walk around until you find their link, find the entrance to their homepage on the main net area, and then congratulations. You can now use their real-world location to jack into the net much further in than just walking there from your own room. Oh, and you need to beat their Navi in a fight to go any further into the net past their homepage. And if you happen to miss one of these steps, you're in for a lot of running around that might make you question if using the shortcut is even worth it at that point. I really wish they'd cut just one step out of the process, and maybe I'm whining too much, but after I beat Skullman and then checked the jar instead of the counter, I had a lousy time of it. As luck would have it, 2 of the game's 8 chapters involve running around this area, so instead of 2 additional, fun little dungeons to explore and puzzles to solve, we get a headache instead. The majority of the enemies you'll be fighting are viruses. While a little rougher and not as creative as some later baddies, I still like most of them and think they fit the world well. 2 notable ones are the Mets, returning as they do in most Megaman series, and Rush, who shows up to play a few rounds of whack-a-mole with you. All the rest are original to my knowledge, and I believe they all have 3 different forms, each stronger and with a palette swap. None of them are too bad on their own, but, as you'd probably imagine, it's certain combinations that can be challenging. Get a few enemies that attack horizontal rows, and you won't have room to dodge. Or an enemy with a strong but limited attack range, and another that eliminates some of your spaces, and it becomes a race to take one of them out before you're doomed. Or just a few enemies that all throw out a good number of projectiles, and you can be in for a bad time. Learning the patterns of each, as well as how they overlap with each other, is the key to staying alive, and which attacks you can bring to best counter them is imperative to taking them down. Then there are the bosses, which are the real stars of the show, even if they get less face time. Most of these net navis have Robot Master equivalents, and I plan on comparing and contrasting them sometime down the line. Back to the present though, a good number of these are alternate versions of the bosses from the first Mega Man game, only Cutman being absent. which is fine, I guess. They probably just wanted to make sure they got him right, I'm sure. Anyway, most of them either use variations of attack they used in the classic series, or at least a fighting style that makes sense for them. Gutsman is a bruiser, using fists and hammers. Fireman looks like a smokestack and has flamethrower arms. Iceman's an even more diminutive version of himself and uses ice blocks and ice bombs. Stoneman's a Minecraft block for some reason, and he just drops rocks on your head. Elecman has these power transformers on his back, which look pretty neat, and summons lightning to either hit you or power up himself. Proto-Man is Proto-Man, and he uses a sword. Because they have edges. And also blocks a lot, the weenie. Woodman grows trees, and Skullman is cartoonishly creepy, which makes him a favorite of mine. While his attacks are basic, they do work in tandem to cut down on your maneuvering room. Magic Man has swapped from being a magician to full-on wizard, and has either a beak or a beard. Probably a beard, but I thought it was an almost Plague Doctor's-like mask when I was younger. Anyway, he summons viruses while just shooting out a line of magic fire himself. Bomb Man's back and he's still ugly, just not as ugly, and he kicks bombs at you. And Roll's here, but you don't fight her. You just get her Navi chip, which will summon her to do a decent bit of damage and heal you. What a supportive friend. Oh yeah, Rock and Roll aren't siblings in this, which can make things somewhat awkward at points for fans of the classic games. As for original characters, you have Number Man, who uses several different types of bombs. I really like the guy, even if he is kind of a stereotype of a nerd. Color Man has two idols that move around in front of him and occasionally attack with either heat or aqua element. And he also has a ball he can send your way. Sharkman hides under floor, only his fin poking out with two decoys. Each fin can attack you, but just one at a time, and you need to hit the real one to expose the boss, though he still takes damage even when he's hiding. These two are kind of a pain since both use their extra helpers to block for him, and if any of these happen to line up with the boss's movements, you have to desync them again to get a clear shot. While you can find ways around this, such as hucking a bomb or using an attack that goes through multiple targets, I'm not a fan of reworking my entire folder just to deal with one specific enemy, so I really don't like these fights. Final boss is the Life Virus, which looks intimidating, but ain't too bad. Sure, it summons smaller viruses to help it, and to actually hurt it, you need to take out its aura by doing 100 damage in a single shot, which reforms in between its attacks. But by that point in the game, you should have plenty of chips to punch through it, and even if you don't, it drops the aura for a second to attack, so you have a lot of chances to counter it. Post-game, you get 3 extra bosses. Pharaoh Man is designed like a sarcophagus, which is pretty cool. He just kinda floats around while summoning coffins and Anubises to attack. Shadow Man factors pretty heavily into the next game, so we'll talk about him there. And finally, the only one I have not beaten is Base.EXE. To unlock him as a random encounter in the final part of the net, you need to have every chip besides Life Aura, which he drops. This is no mean feat since there are 175 total, and to get some of them, you need to jump through some hoops. The hardest of all to collect are the Navi chips. Each has 3 versions, and you get them by beating the Navi in question with a good score and hoping that RNG favors you. Navis belonging to NetOps that your friends, or at least allies with, you can talk to for rematches. But bad guys, you need to find their ghost in specific spots, and then fight them as a random encounter in the same area after that. Normally you get the version 1 for the first time you rematch them, and it's not too hard to get version 3 if you battle them well, but getting that lucky number 2 drop can be a nightmare, and since you have to get them as a fairly uncommon random encounter, you can guess how hard it is to fill out your library. At the moment I need 20 chips to complete my collection, and 13 of them are Navi chips, so I'm close, but it's gonna take some more grinding and a lot of luck to finish it out. Please keep me in your thoughts. The music is a lot different than typical Mega Man fare, and that's largely because of how many hats the OST needs to wear. You still have combat, but also downtime, exploration, exposition, emergencies, etc., and most of the themes they choose for these fit pretty well. Still though, it is pretty simple and does seem to loop pretty early, so it does feel a bit lacking, especially compared to much of the rest of the series. It's understandable that the first entry would be the most basic, so I can't hate on it too much. Plus, since you have random encounters to contend with, a long stage theme for the network areas might not make the most sense, though you do get a chance to give them a listen when you stop to tackle a puzzle. My personal favorites are Running Through the Cyber World, which uses elements from the main theme and plays during the school level, and Electrical Crisis, which is for the power plant stage. And the virus and boss battle music aren't bad either, which is good since you can wind up listening to these for longer stints. I am a little bummed that the track for the final net levels are a little subdued, which I get is supposed to symbolize the calm before the storm. At that point in the game though, I want to be jazzed up. And bringing up the main internet area again, what plays for that sounds like what play in the background if you were in Purgatory, which is appropriate enough, but it does make me hate it even more. Overall, a pretty okay soundtrack. While there's nothing that will make you want to rip your ears off, very few tracks are worth listening to outside of the context of the game. Visually, the game is like the music. Not bad, but not great. Most character models look pretty good, especially the combat ones, even if they do seem a bit rougher than later entries. When it comes to areas, AC/DC looks pleasant and the final area has some interesting things going on, but Dentown largely looks like a screen copy-pasted several times, and while there are a few nice looking spots in the government complex, most of it just feels like sterile hallways and waiting rooms. And when it comes to the net, well, most parts are just pathways floating in space, having screensavers as backgrounds. Just a few simple images scrolling by. This could be a make or break for some people since it's not much to look at. I don't mind it so much, since I get it, there are data paths you travel through, and since it's not a physical place, everything else is just empty space. Plus, I'm the type to prioritize gameplay followed by story over visuals. My brother refuses to play any of these games though just because of how dull the scenery looks. The lack of landmarks also make it hard for him to keep track of where he's been and where he's going. While I think he's placing too much importance on this since he really likes the character designs and combat, I do have to at least admit that I get where he's coming from, and in this entry, it's especially bad. Later games toss in a few landmarks and bury up the flooring a bit, so it's a lot more tolerable, but here, they really are simple, looking more like a proof of concept than a finished stage. About the only level this works pretty effectively in is the power plant, which I'm beginning to think might be my favorite stage, where you have invisible walkways you have to feel out. The flat, black background against the more yellowish platforms make a nice contrast, and the lightning that flashes in the background during battles makes you feel pretty tense. And the worst offender is, once again, the main net area. There is nothing distinct or interesting to look at when it comes to the paths, just looking like something someone whipped up in paint, and the background is just a checkerboard pattern of a more peachish color with golden E's floating by. While the way they twist and turn ain't bad, seriously, why just the letter E? Does it stand for electronics, email, that Markiplier meme? If you go into any of the connected home pages, you get neat little sprites that, while they aren't too detailed, are cute and have some personality, from Dex's rice balls to Miyu's skulls. If they threw a few of these in as you unlock shortcuts to vary things up or just randomly swap between them, the net would at least be a bit more pleasant to look at. It's not the worst looking game out there, but the original definitely comes in last for the series. Improvement's good though. When it comes to difficulty, I'd say Battle Network is easily the easiest. You heal after every battle, and since they were still figuring a lot of things out, it's also the simplest, so they don't ask you to do anything too crazy. Plus, you don't need to learn anything too complicated, like style changes, double souls, or Navi customizers. You can just kinda go in without thinking too hard. Likewise, this is also the one that's the easiest to complete, since to get the secret final boss, all you need to do is collect all the chips other than the one he drops. Not only are there less chips in this one, you also don't have to do anything like activate all the program advances or collect some of the extra power-ups or forms. Granted, it's still a pain to get some of those Navi chips, there's just relatively less to worry about. But even though I say it's the easiest, the original Battle Network might also be the most frustrating. I already talked about how horrible it is trying to navigate the main internet area, as well as a few of the little annoyances some of the bosses have, but even beyond that, this game has a habit of completely wasting your time and being really obtuse with how you're meant to progress. At one point, I needed to get into a certain room to jack into that chapter's dungeon, so I talked to every NPC and interacted with every object I could, doors included, but all I got was one guy saying he was working to unlock the door. At that point, I ran around that floor, trying to jack in every few feet, hoping there was something I could interact with that way. I continued to do that while talking or clicking on everything again, and after my second or third go-round, an NPC told me that one of the doors had been finally unlocked. While I could probably rewatch the footage and work backwards to determine the exact order of steps, the fact that it's not immediately obvious is kind of a problem. Later, after trying to find the path forward in the main net area for over an hour, I located the right passage, but was informed that I needed to find 3 real-world NPCs to get their codes to proceed through the following several screens, meaning that I'd need to make my way through the labyrinth again after doing so. And in the last chapter, after finding the villain's transport to their secret base, I had to take the item I needed to use it, which I already had, to another character who was in a whole different area, to fix, then make my way back. While some of this stuff is expected in RPGs, a lot of it feels really arbitrary and like it's there to drag things out, as if they realized that if they didn't throw in some pointless running around, most people would easily be able to clear the game in under 10 hours, which just wouldn't do given the genre. I've been playing some of Battle Network 3 on the side, and while I can't deny that there is still some of this jerking around, it feels much better integrated and natural, compared to the clumsy and irritating use here. I did play the whole game in 2 streams, so maybe the longer play sessions wore on my patience some, but even with that in mind, this game feels really drawn out, despite it being the shortest in the series. Mega Man Battle Network, much like the original Mega Man, is a game where it's really obvious that it's the first in a series. While the developers clearly had a lot of really strong ideas, they were still feeling out the best ways to implement them, and we'd have to wait for the payoff. Only one major misstep saves this game from being the worst in the series. End of the day, while I wouldn't call Battle Network a bad game, I wouldn't call it a fantastic one either. If I'd done this review over a year ago, I would have said that it wasn't worth tracking down the cartridge, and probably still skippable for most on the Wii U eShop. Currently, since most people interested in Battle Network are probably going to be getting their fix through the 2 Legacy collections, and those are a package deal, I'd say why not? Use a walkthrough, look up some maps, and the game is tolerable enough that you can bang it out really quick. That way, you get the story, experience, and bragging rights. And if you try to get through it without any help, well, I warned you. You did this to yourself. To go back to the original question though, the game was largely what I remembered. A pretty simple affair, though I have to admit that all the errands and meandering were worse than I recalled. But what do you think? Am I too harsh on this one, or right on target? If you're new, did I scare you off the game, or at least convince you to use a guide? And since this is the first Battle Network game I've covered, unless we count Network Transmission, is there anything I missed or should have covered in more depth? Platformers and RPGs are very different genres, so I'm still kind of feeling this out. For now though, thanks for watching, maybe consider subscribing if you like Mega Man, and perhaps I'll see you in the next one. For everlasting peace.